use molecular phylogenies and the fossil record to infer clues about the origin of the Ur Bilaterian, the hypothetical first bilateral metazoan. We start by looking at the genes shared by all living bilaterians. What kind of animal do these genes make? The genes of modern bilaterians imply that the Ur Bilaterian had some pretty sophisticated equipment, namely segmentation, eyes, a heart, limbs, a head and a tail, a front and a back, a mouth, and a coelom. In other words, it was a complicated organism. The snag is we see nothing like this a billion years ago, or even 650 million years ago. Worse, we also don't see things you might expect to result from an Ur Bilaterian crawling around, like the trace fossils made by walking, burrowing, or eating sediment. So this leads to another thought. Maybe the Ur Bilaterian looked like the larval form of one of the ancestral metazoans. Perhaps the Ur Bilaterian was a planula-like animal, like the larvae of living corals. Planula larvae have a small number of cell types. They use cilia for locomotion, they're flattened, and they're bilaterally symmetrical, and they have a mouth. But compared to a complex animal, a planula is simple, even though it has all the genes of a more complex animal. The basic Ur Bilaterian might have been simpler than the complex version envisioned above. A planula-like Ur Bilaterian would have had a head and a tail, some type of photoreceptor like the pigmented cells on a flatworm, a nerve network, a simple gut with just one opening, but no heart or segmentation and no appendages. Hence, we can still have an animal that has genes that eventually make complex structures, but is packaged in a body so small that it does not need all that complexity. There are not that many steps from a cnidarian planula to a bilaterian larvae. We do not need to envision unusually rapid evolution to get the metazoan groups from a planula-like ancestor. Now, this planula argument is attractive because it explains some puzzles of the fossil record. First, we have no trace fossil evidence of coeloms until about 540 million years ago, when metazoan burrows turn up abundantly. Now remember that there is, of course, the trace fossil record from Uruguay at 585 million years ago, and that does get us closer to the time when the Ur Bilaterian might have evolved. But there's still a big mismatch in timing, even if those trace fossils can be confirmed. So our trace fossil record still does not match up well with the molecular clock inferences. Second, the idea that the initial metazoans were small is partly supported by the record of the small shelly fossils mentioned before. Many of the small shelly fossils are microscopic animals that were members of the myofauna, living between sand grains. They consist of tiny cap-shaped shells, spiral shells of low-spired or planospiraled snail-like animals, and tiny cap-like plates that protected animals hiding in tubes in the sediment. Hence, the Cambrian explosion is a combination of skeletonization, an increase in body size, and the evolution of greater morphological complexity that comes with a larger body. These big animals need legs, a heart, respiratory systems, and other features that a tiny planula does not need. Note that the Cambrian explosion is not an actual explosion of animal body plans as we used to think. Indeed, the evolution of metazoans was a comparatively lazy affair. If the molecular clocks are right, metazoans appear a good billion years ago. Sponges appear about 700 million years ago. Our planula-like metazoans appear about 650 million years ago, but are probably so small that their fossil record is still unknown. Instead, the Cambrian explosion is actually an explosion of the abundance of large fossils that appear long after the metazoans began their radiation. The explosion involved big innovations that transformed the fossil record and Earth. Skeletons not only improve the fossil record, but also support the evolution of big animals with very diverse ecologies. For example, we get animals big enough to feed in the plankton. They package their waste into poop that sinks rapidly to the sea floor. This fecal pellet express greatly speeds up the process of making and sinking marine snow, and accordingly increases the burial of organic matter in seafloor sediments. Conversely, the coelom of big animals has the opposite effect. As I have argued, the coelom allows animals to burrow efficiently. Burrowing is a hugely productive strategy for both protection and finding food. So the Cambrian explosion also aids in liberating buried nutrients back into the ocean where they could be used again. The Cambrian explosion sets up this powerful combination of fecal pellet formation and burrowing that transforms Earth by speeding up the overall recycling of nutrients both into and out of the sediment. Hence, the Cambrian explosion is one of the milestones in the increase in Earth's planetary metabolism.